All right, good morning. We'll get started here in just a minute. All right, good to see everybody this morning. We are continuing our class on looking at texts in the Old Testament that don't seem profitable for Christians today, and then examining those to find out how they are profitable, like Paul said that they are. And so most of you have been here, and the last week we talked about the details of the tabernacle and how that is so beneficial for us to understand what the book of Exodus is doing with that, what lessons we can draw from that. That's a necessary foundation for what we're going to talk about today. Because this morning we're talking about the ritual purity laws, primarily found in Leviticus, but these ritual purity laws that are there for the very reason that God lives among his people in the tabernacle. And so you can't really talk about the ritual purity laws or appreciate them fully unless you understand there is a tabernacle that God has designated as his dwelling place where he would manifest his presence among his people, and that he would travel with them in this tabernacle as they journeyed around. He would live among them. That's a necessary thing to understand before we talk about these ritual purity laws. So this morning we're going to try and just get a good grasp of what these laws are. This is going to be a two-part class, so we'll talk about these ritual purity laws today and next Sunday. And this morning, we're just going to try and understand what they are, or a good summary of the concept of ritual purity or ceremonial purity, ceremonial cleanliness. We're going to try and understand what these laws are all about. And then next week, next Sunday, then we're really going to try and connect it to how it's profitable for us. And here's why. First of all, for a lot of us, this is just kind of brand new. For a lot of us, Leviticus is not one of the top books we've studied. It's one of the more challenging books for us, partially because there's things in Leviticus that are just so foreign to our culture. We just don't understand some of these concepts because we don't really have this in our American culture. We don't really have this in our Christian culture. Some of these rituals or these concepts, and so that makes it challenging. And so what I want to do is let's at least understand first what's being taught, what these are all about, and then once we do, then we can look at how it's profitable to us. So really what I'm saying is we kind of are tempted a lot of times to immediately jump to how it connects to Jesus, just right away, and so we hear the word sacrifice and boom, we just jump right to Jesus. Well, he's the ultimate sacrifice. Instead of looking at, okay, what are the specifics of the sacrifices the Israelites had to offer? Let's look at those details, look at that concept and what they had to do. Then it'll give you a better appreciation for how Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. Same thing with these purity laws. We may hear the word purity and think, well, we've been purified by Christ, and we immediately jump there and start talking about that, and that's just premature. We need to at least first, let's examine what these laws are. Let's examine what these concepts are in Leviticus, get a good understanding of it. Then when we connect it to Christ and we connect it to our relationship in Jesus, then we have a much more grounded appreciation for it. Instead of just sort of a superficial understanding of what the Old Testament says, it's so much more beneficial to have a deep appreciation and understanding of what the Old Testament says, so that then that connection to Christ is so much stronger. So, all that to say, today we're going to summarize and talk about these laws. Next week, we're really going to then try and establish how it's profitable, how we could use it in our lives, and all of that. So, before we get into the specific sections in Leviticus, I just want to remind us of the context. You know, sometimes if you've read Leviticus, it doesn't really seem like a narrative, right? Because it's mostly not. I mean, technically it is, because it's God talking to Moses, and so it's just sort of one series of speeches with some narrative parts in there. But it doesn't seem like a story, really. But it has a context. Leviticus was given to Moses to give to the priests in Israel while Moses is on the mountain of Sinai, and it's after Israel has come out of slavery. And so here's the real context that's so important. Israel has been in slavery in Egypt for many years. And this is something I think we don't often realize. They weren't in slavery as faithful, Yahweh-worshiping Israelites. They worshiped the gods of Egypt too. The Israelites, when they were in Egypt, they worshiped some of the Egyptian gods. They had some idols of the Egyptian gods. Probably they had some idols from even their ancestry, Abraham's ancestors. And even when they came out of Egypt, they still held on to some of those idols. Joshua makes this point when he gives that famous speech, choose this day whom you'll serve. He tells them, put away the gods you served in Egypt. And the prophet Ezekiel really makes a point of describing that and saying, when Israel was in Egypt, they were not righteous. They worshiped the gods of Egypt. Now, they also acknowledged the Lord, right? So it's not that they had lost all concept of God. They just were polytheistic, right? And so Yahweh, okay, that's our God of our ancestors, but we also serve these other gods. And so what had happened was they'd made God common, right? He was just one of the gods. And because of that, they had major misunderstandings of the Lord. And often they thought of the Lord the same way that the pagans thought of their gods. And so, for example, the pagans thought their gods were territorial. That this God is only the God of this land, this region. But, you go to a different land, and that God doesn't have any power anymore. Now the God of that land has power. And the God of this land is limited to this territory. That's how pagans thought of their gods. And that's often how Israel thought of the Lord. That's why when they get to the promised land, they don't think God can give them victory because, but this is a new land. And we're going in there with those people. We don't think we're going to get victory there. They were thinking of God as only powerful in certain areas. And the pagans thought that way, and so the Israelites had picked up a lot of that. And so really what the Israelites needed when they came out of Egypt was to be reintroduced to God, reintroduced to Him, retaught about Him. And so God gave them these laws using stuff they were familiar with. They understood what priests were generally, because other religions had priests. They understood what sacred areas were and temples and all of that, altars, sacrifices. Those existed in the pagan nations, but God is giving them these laws, and His reason for these laws is very different from the pagans. And some of the changes He makes in how the Israelites will practice their religion, very different from the pagans. And those differences are huge, because those differences are going to clarify God is not like the pagan gods. So they may have their altars, and they may have their places where they do this and this and this. They may have their priests, but the Lord, His priests are going to be like this. And His sacrifices and His altar and all of this, very different in a lot of significant ways. And so it's a way to teach and help Israel understand who God is. And like I said, we're just not familiar with this. The idea of ritual purity, ceremonial purity, that's just absent from our culture, but it wasn't in the ancient world. In the ancient world, all the nations in their religions had ritual, ceremonial purity and ceremonial impurity, ceremonial cleanness and uncleanness. That was a common thing in the ancient world. And so that concept, the Israelites got. But the reason for the laws and the way that God differs from the other gods, that's the significant thing. And so one of the other reasons why we struggle with a lot of this is because we read Leviticus, we read some of these laws throughout the Old Testament, and it's only the words, because we don't see it then visually being acted out. You know, for the Israelites, yes, it was words that they would have read or heard spoken to them, but then they would have seen it. They would have seen the specific sacrifices. They would have seen the rituals. They would have seen the Day of Atonement take place. And that just would have made it so much easier for them to understand, oh, this is what this concept means. It's harder for us because we can read through some of these, but then we don't get to see, okay, now here it is. And so I think it's really beneficial for us to intentionally imagine what it would have been like. So after this class is over, later today, whenever you decide to go back, I would encourage you to read through some of these and imagine what would it have looked like to be in this kind of society among the Israelites where this was what our culture did. This is what our nation did. This is how we operated. There would have been this and this and this. Imagine that. Because we don't get to see it, so imagine it to help us appreciate what's going on here. All right, these purity laws, they're in a few places. Specifically, though, Leviticus chapters 11 through 16, a lot of these laws are found there. And then in several chapters in Numbers. They're also found in Exodus and Deuteronomy as well, but these are the primary spots. And here's the big picture summary of all of this. Not just the ritual purity laws, all the laws that God gave Israel. In Leviticus 11, God said, "For I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." And once again, I made this point last week. Holy doesn't just mean good. It doesn't just mean righteous or spiritual. Holy means set apart from what is common. And so, okay, if there's any being that is set apart from what is common, it's the Lord. And so what God is trying to teach Israel is, I am set apart. I am not like the pagan gods. I'm not like humans. I'm not like anything. I am holy, holy, holy. And God is telling them, I have brought you out of Egypt to be holy too. And so because I am set apart, you are to be set apart. And so all of these ritual purity laws are driving home the point. God is set apart. We are to be set apart. Yes, in their morality, of course, in their behavior, in their morality, set apart. They're not supposed to sin. But it's more than just that. They're going to engage in rituals that just reflect the concept of being set apart, even when you're not really talking about something about morality. It's just to reinforce the idea of set apart, not common. All of these laws are going to drive home that point. So let's give a definition of the idea of ritual cleanness, ritual holiness, ceremonial cleanness. This isn't my definition. I didn't come up with this, but I really appreciate the way that this is worded. I think this is a great way to describe it. Ritual cleanness is an imaginary way of perceiving and classifying people, places, and things loosely based on the idea of hygienic cleanliness. Let me read it again. An imaginary way of perceiving and classifying people, places, and things loosely based on the idea of hygienic cleanliness. All right, so let's break this down. God told Israel, I want you to see things a certain way. I want you to categorize things a certain way, classify things, people, places, and things. And he wanted them to classify things in these categories: unclean, clean, or set apart, holy. Those were the classifications he wanted them to use. And, we see that word imaginary. Don't confuse what I'm saying. I don't mean imaginary like it's silly or childish, like a kid who has an imaginary friend. These laws were not silly, not childish. God was very serious about these laws. But I say imaginary because the things God deemed as unclean, they didn't actually have dirt on them. There wasn't actually like a substance on them like, oh, great, now there's this stuff on me. But they had to imagine that that was the case. They had to act as if that was true. And things that were deemed clean, it didn't mean, there isn't dirt on this, or this is free of germs, and so it's safe to touch. That wasn't literally true, but they were to act as if that is true. That's the whole point of ritual purity or ceremonial purity. It takes the idea of literal cleanliness and says you are to imagine that is the case, that this thing is unclean and that it does have something on it that then would make you unclean. And so it's not about literal health or hygiene. And I'm going to stress this a lot. This is a common misconception when people are discussing the law of Moses. I've heard it for years. People say, well, some of these laws are to protect Israel from sickness, and some of these laws are to protect Israel from unsanitary conditions in the camp. Or that, well, some of the laws, with the food are to protect Israel from food poisoning. That's not what this is about. In fact, God never says any of that. The reasons God gives for these are not literal health and hygiene. The reasons God gives for it is these laws will instill in you the concept of being set apart. But it does use terms like clean or washing or purifying or defilement. That's the imagery that any religion that had ritual purity would have used. Those terms are there, and you even have ritual washings or ritual cleansings, and we may think, oh, they're washing it because there's germs on it. That's really not the case. They're washing it so that it is considered clean now. Now it has entered into a clean state and is no longer in that unclean state. That's why these occurred. And you'll even see things like, well, it's become clean because it got sprinkled clean. Water got sprinkled on it. Well, sprinkling water on something doesn't literally cleanse it. That's actually ineffective. You want to really clean something literally, don't just sprinkle it. Wash it for real. Like immerse it in water, scrub it. But that's because it's not about literal cleanliness. It is about ritual cleanliness. And then here's another important point. Being unclean did not necessarily mean you had sinned. Now, sometimes it did. Obviously, if you commit adultery, well, you'd be considered unclean in the law of Moses. But that is largely not the case with clean and unclean. It didn't mean you'd sinned. And often there's such a negative connotation with the word unclean that our minds just go to that. But don't, because there were plenty of times where it is absolutely fine that you're unclean or that something is unclean as long as You recognized that it was unclean, and you followed the proper rituals for going to clean again, entering into the state of clean. And we'll see this when we get into some of the specifics of why something will be unclean. But sometimes you were unclean for something that was good. So once again, it doesn't necessarily mean you had sinned. What it did mean was you're in this state. You are not in this state, and there are laws to govern what you're supposed to do. Impurity, this ritual impurity, most of the time, the majority of the time, spread by physical contact. If I'm in an unclean state and I come shake someone's hand, now they're in an unclean state. If somebody who is unclean was sitting there and they got up and then I went and sat in that same chair, I'm considered unclean now. Physical contact was the way that this ritual impurity was spread most of the time. And there were certain laws, sometimes simple laws, sometimes very detailed laws for how you would move between these different ritual states. If something is unclean, there's a ritual, there's laws for how then it moves to clean. If something is clean, there are laws for how it is to be set apart. And so the way that the Israelites became priests, those that were allowed to become priests, there's a major ritual for how a regular Levite Israelite would then enter into the holy status of now being a priest, a very long, extensive ritual. Then there's other things that can't move. There are some things that are unclean that will stay there, and there's no ritual to move them to clean. Some things are holy and should never drop to clean, right? The tabernacle itself, always to remain holy. And unfortunately, there were times where it was defiled because Israel broke these laws and treated it as common. And now they have perverted the holiness of the tabernacle by treating it as common, treating it as clean or unclean. And so here's the big picture summary statement of what God says about this. This is what he told Aaron and the priests. He said, you are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. God tells the priest, teach Israel how to see things this way. Teach them how to classify things this way. Teach them how to understand what being set apart is. And not just morally, but just the concept of set apart. The way that I've tried to think of a way to explain this, I mean, imagine if I am someone that I'm just a reckless driver and I am constantly running red lights and it's just dangerous and I'm just transgressing traffic safety and just transgressing human life in the process. So yes, I think I should be required to practice stopping at red lights. But what if also I was required to play the game red light, green light on a regular basis, right? Most of you know the game of red light, green light. It is a child's game, which makes this analogy not that great because the law of Moses is not childish. But it's still the concept of I am practicing the concept of I stop when it's red and I go when it's green. And me playing that every day, multiple times a day, would instill in me that concept. That's similar to what's happening here with Israel. That practicing to distinguish clean and unclean in things that don't involve sin is instilling in them that greater concept of distinguishing between moral purity and immorality, and God who is holy and the pagan gods who are not, and the pagan nations who are not holy, and the Israelites who have been set apart. In Leviticus 15, God says, Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. This is the key to it, because unclean and clean, it all relates to the fact that they're all required to go to the tabernacle close to God's presence and to offer their sacrifices as worship to God. And what God is saying is, I want you all to do that, but at the same time, not when you are in an unclean state. When you approach my tabernacle, when you approach my holy presence, you have to have the proper understanding of my holiness and the proper understanding that I am set apart. And one of the ways they did that, yes, was acting morally in their behavior, but also expressing their understanding by following the ritual purity laws of, I am in an unclean state, and now I will not approach God's tabernacle until I have done the laws and rituals that now place me in a clean state where now I can approach. That is how I show respect for the holiness of the Lord. And so what you have is a constant amount of activity, right? Because there are people that would be in an unclean state and engage in a ritual, and those that would be in a clean state and go into the tabernacle. But then there'd be a change for some reason, and now this person is in this state. And that is just a constant thing the nation had going on. This was part of their culture now. It was a God-centered, God-focused culture. It was a holiness-focused culture where everyone communally understood, or at least they should have, they didn't always do it properly, everyone communally understood this is how we act in order to reinforce the idea that God is holy. Uncleanness, if you're unclean, it meant seclusion in your home or separation from the camp. Once again, this isn't a punishment. I mean, sometimes it was if you had sinned. Obviously, if you had committed some sinful behavior, then your seclusion or your separation from the camp was a punishment. But that's not the case for a lot of the time. Seclusion in your home or separation from outside the camp was just a way of honoring that now that we are putting a distance between us and God's presence in the tabernacle to honor the fact that God is holy. And we'll see as we get into some of the specifics why somebody would be secluded in their home or separated from the camp. And so I also just want to make clear, we may see this and think, oh my goodness, what a horrible punishment. But everyone had to do that at some point, right? It wasn't like it's only this guy that's always getting kicked out of the camp. No, everyone would have encountered something where, okay, now I'm in this state, I will be in my tent the rest of the day. Or this has occurred with me, and now I'm living outside of the camp. And then once the ritual is done or the time period is done, I then return. Everybody would have been doing that. So it wasn't a thing where, somebody would have felt ashamed for that. It was a communal part of the nation. All right, there are 4 primary sources of ritual impurity. One of the things that's challenging for us is God doesn't always tell us why He specifically decided this would be unclean. He gives us a big picture reason why He has unclean things, but not always why this specific thing is unclean. Sometimes we can kind of figure it out or think like it's probably because of this. And that's what this first one is. Dead bodies were a source of ritual uncleanness. If you touched a dead body, now you're ritually unclean. And once again, your relative dies, you bury them, you're ritually unclean, that's fine. You're not sinful for that. There's no negative connotation of that. But if you had touched a dead body, whether it's a human or an animal, if you had touched a dead body, the only problem would be is if you ignore the laws for uncleanness. If you follow the laws for uncleanness, the rituals for that, no problem. But that would be something that would make you ritually unclean. And so with this, God doesn't specifically say why. I think it's fairly obvious, though, of all things that would deem someone unclean, death, right? And that makes sense why that would be. The consequence of sin would be something that would make someone unclean. And the fact that, God is the author of life, the one true living God, well, then, of course, death is just the complete opposite of him. And so it makes sense why he would decide encounter with dead bodies would be something that would put you in the unclean state, and then now you would have to either be in your tent or outside the camp for a time. Here's another one. Leprosy. And skin conditions is really how we should think of it. This could be a whole class in of itself. When the Bible talks about leprosy, 99% of the time, it's not talking about our modern understanding of leprosy, where you have somebody that has this terminal disease where their flesh is decaying and it's a death sentence, and if they touch someone, that person also has that, and they need to be separated to save people's lives, like in a leper colony, because they are so contagious and they are dying. That's not what the Bible's talking about 99% of the time, Old Testament or New Testament. That's not a great translation. In fact, that's why a lot of commentators will say, well, yeah, leprosy, but really it's skin conditions. And Leviticus lists out the specific conditions, and they're not the things that we think of when we think of leprosy. They're things like psoriasis. They're things like infections in the skin. They're things like a boil or a burn, or even things that sound like, well, this sounds like eczema, something like that. But skin conditions, and the whole point of Leviticus is that these things heal and get better. So like, okay, well, that wouldn't even fit with our understanding of modern day, or our modern day understanding of leprosy. But this is something that would make you ritually impure if you had certain skin conditions. Now the question is like, well, why that? Of all ailments, why is that the thing that God would say makes you ritually unclean? We're not sure. There's some guesses as to why. Possibly because it's a visual thing that mars you. And so because it's a visual thing that mars you, then it's a perfect example of honoring God's wholeness and God's purity, because, well, this visual thing that mars my skin now is just a great way to show, well, then we don't go near God's perfection, his holiness, as a way to honor that, even though there's other illnesses, there's other sicknesses. But this one, maybe it was chosen because of how visual it was. It also just may be because the tabernacle is all about barriers and boundaries. Barriers, boundaries. There's a fence around the tabernacle. There are divisions in the tabernacle. Do not approach. Do not go past this. And so with skin conditions, when they're serious and the skin has broken, those serious skin conditions, now you're ritually unclean. It may be because the barriers of your body visibly have been broken. And so then what a great object lesson to show the respect for holy barriers, by that being one of the reasons why you're ritually impure. We can talk more about that after class if there's any questions about that. The next category, sexual functions. Here is where I'm going to switch the class from G-rated to PG or PG-13. I don't see any kids in the audience. The Israelites, and maybe everyone in the ancient culture, they were much more comfortable talking about these things than we are. So I'm just going to tell you what the Bible says. I don't know that we have to expound a whole lot on all of this, but this would have been something very normal for them. that they spoke about and they taught about. Sexual intercourse between husband and wife, you're unclean after that. And you would have to be in your tent the rest of the day. So some people are thinking, hey, that doesn't sound bad to me, in the tent the rest of the day. But you are separated in the tent for the rest of the day after normal sexual relations with your husband or wife. But there's also other things. Childbirth. Childbirth, the child would not be unclean. The mother would be considered unclean. And the common thing among all these sexual functions is the loss of fluid. That's the common thing among these. So obviously in childbirth, the child isn't the problem, but blood is lost, fluid is lost. And so that, once again, it seems like the breaking of the boundaries of your body may be behind a lot of the reasons for this. But also, women in their menstruation were considered unclean. And so they were secluded during that time. Once again, the loss of blood. And then men. Men, when they had any sort of fluid loss, for example, Leviticus mentions this, when they're sleeping at night, when they had sexual fluid loss, when that happened, they're considered unclean. Also, if there's any sort of sexual diseases, where there's fluid loss because of any sort of disease in men or women, now they're in an unclean state. And so probably the reason behind that is, like I said, that there's some sort of association with the boundaries of your body being broken, where now there is loss of blood especially. That may be why this would put you in an unclean state. But I do think another major reason for this being something that keeps you away from God's presence at the tabernacle relates to the pagan nations. Because I don't mean this, I don't mean to be irreverent at all. We recognize that engaging in sexual activity is not a way to worship God. And we recognize that God himself does not engage in sexual activity. But the pagan nations believe the opposite. For the pagan nations, sexual activity in the temples was a way to honor the pagan gods, which is why they had pagan prostitution. And they believed the gods did engage in sexual activity. They did think that. And so we may sort of scratch our heads and think, well, why would intercourse between husband and wife, which is a blessing, that's something that God created, in the garden with Adam and Eve, why would that be something they would have to stay away from God's presence? My theory is that because though God does acknowledge it as good, he does not want them to imitate what the pagans do and think sexuality, sexual activity is now part of what God does, or a way that we serve God by doing that at his temple. And so he put that boundary there, I think, for that reason, to show the Israelites, don't be like the pagans. The deprived minds of the pagans, that is not how you are to be. And then one more category of ritual impurity, and that's the one we're probably most familiar with, certain meats, right? The food laws. Certain animals were considered unclean, don't eat them, and other animals were considered clean, you can eat them. And one of the major questions we had, and I'm just not satisfied really with any of the explanations I've read, we struggle with why that animal is clean and that animal's not. And there's a lot of theories out there as to why God made the distinctions between certain animals. And some say, well, maybe this animal, if you ate it wrong, you could get sick from it. No matter what explanation you have, there's just going to be things that don't add up. What I've looked at, and I don't think that Israel is so unintelligent that God's telling them like, hey, if you cook pigs wrong, you're going to get sick, so don't do that. Because none of the other nations had that law. And I don't think the other nations were just so much smarter and knew how to cook pigs correctly and not get poisoned by pork, but dumb Israel was just going to get sick all the time from pigs, and so God wanted to protect them from that. I don't think that's the case. But I don't know what the specific reasons are. There's probably 4 or 5 different theories as to why these animals are okay to eat and why these animals aren't. But the big picture as to why these laws exist is very clear. And so I want to just remind us of these ritual states. You have unclean, you have clean, and you have holy in all aspects of their life. Well, then especially then with the food laws, that's also the case. And so for the food laws, you had unclean animals that could not be eaten. They're unclean. They were to see these animals as unclean for food. They could touch the animals. They could use the animals for agriculture or farming. Couldn't eat them, though. And then you had clean animals that they could eat. You were allowed to eat these. You can see these and classify these as clean animals. But then of those clean animals, some of those clean animals were fit for sacrifice. So you have bulls and goats, lambs, that then could be holy. They could be set apart and used for sacrifice. And so once again, you just have these concepts as part of their culture. And especially with the food laws, it's to put a barrier between Israel and the nations. Because the Israelites' diet was very different from the other nations. And eating together had such a strong connotation of fellowship in the ancient world that when God gave them these food laws, He actually made it very difficult for them to sit down socially and engage in any sort of fellowship with pagans because they can't eat the same food. And God knew that would be the case. And so look at what He says in Leviticus 20. You shall not walk in the customs of the nation that I am driving out before you, for they did all these sinful things that He just described, and therefore I detested them. But I have said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has separated you from the peoples. You shall therefore separate the clean beast from the unclean, and the unclean bird from the clean. You shall not make yourselves detestable by beast or by bird or by anything with which the ground crawls, which I have set apart for you to hold unclean. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine. So regardless of the specific reasons why they can't eat a catfish, but they are allowed to eat a locust. Why exactly that? Besides the specifics, let's at least appreciate that God is saying, I told you to make distinctions between clean and unclean because I made a distinction with you. I didn't leave you to just be one of the nations. I separated you from the nations. You honor that concept by separating the clean food from the unclean. That is the way that you honor the concept of holiness. All right. That's a lot. And I sort of came into this class annoyed at myself because it's just impossible to really give this full justice in a couple classes. But I hope that's at least a big picture summary of what's going on here. There are tons of principles this would have instilled in the Israelites. Besides just the concept of God is holy, there are so many things this would have driven home to them. And remember, these are a people that have been pretty godless for generations. And they have allowed worldly mindsets to creep into their nation. And God is using these concepts to mold them and shape them and teach them to understand who God is. When I first started studying this, I had about 1 million questions as to, wait a minute, what about this? You may have a lot of those. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about those. Some of those, the Bible provides answers. Some of them, it just doesn't. So we may have to be satisfied with not really knowing some of the specifics. But the big picture reason for all of this, I think the Bible is very clear. What we're going to do is, next week, take all of this. I know it's a lot. And when I was first introduced to it, my mind couldn't hold on to all of this. It was so foreign a concept to me. What we're going to do is take all of this that would have just been the normal understanding of God's laws for the Israelites, the normal part of their everyday life that they would have been used to, that they would have been practicing. And now we're going to look at, okay, how does it connect to us as Christians today? What's the profit in knowing any of this? What's the benefit in knowing any of this? That's what I want to do next week. And so hopefully you can be here and we'll talk about that. Because once I saw the connections, the light bulbs started going on, and I genuinely felt this way. I thought, I love the book of Leviticus. I love these laws because of how powerful they are once you understand them and understand how they connect to the rest of the Bible, how they connect to Jesus, how they connect to our relationship to Christ. It's so amazing. So we'll stop there. I know I talked the entire time. I apologize for that. But I would love to talk to anybody. If you have any questions or comments afterward, please let me know. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.